to another episode of The Tapestry. I'm Dr. Francois Booker Drew, and this podcast is really designed for you as a listener to learn from the journeys of such amazing women and get these nuggets of knowledge where you are able to take that content and transform your life. And so today I am with another good friend of mine, Dr. HARRIET SCHWARTZ, and I'm going to read her resume and then we're going to get right into it, because this is going to be a fabulous conversation as we talk about relationships and race. And so HARRIET is a professor in the Department of Psychology and Counseling at Carlow University in Pittsburgh. Her scholarly interests include teaching as relational practice and teaching and emotion. She is the author of Connected Teaching: Relationship, Power, and Mattering in Higher Education. She also addresses issues such as racism, sexism, and homophobia through non-academic venues such as Public Source and Medium. She serves as lead scholar for education as relational practice and on the interim leadership team for the International Center for Growth and Connection, a group focused on promoting relational cultural theory and related research and practice. In addition, she is so busy, so I don't know how she has even the in addition, but she mentors doctoral students at Antioch, where she received her PhD in leadership and change. And starting in summer 2021, she is going to join the faculty at Antioch full time. And so, HARRIET, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Francois. Thanks for inviting me into conversation with you today.
I am so looking forward to it. HARRIET and I worked together at Antioch, and I met HARRIET when I was a student at Antioch, and she was, for me, someone that I looked up to and still do. And she has been so instrumental in introducing so many of us to this concept that we've talked about on the show previously called relational cultural theory. And so, HARRIET, how would you sum up what RCT is?
So again, Francois, just thanks for inviting me. And I just want to say I'm so thrilled that we've been working together recently, because I learn from you every time we collaborate. So thank you so much. Relational cultural theory is a human development theory, and it was created by Jean Baker Miller, Irene Stiver, and Judy Jordan, and then eventually some additional colleagues who were up working in the Wellesley area, primarily in the late 70s and early 80s. That's when the theory really began to be developed. And they were responding to the idea that the prevailing human development theories of the day really privileged this idea of autonomy and independence as goals of development. And they really believed that when they looked at the lives of their clients, and I think themselves and their friends and their colleagues, that people are at their best when they can engage in healthy, growth-fostering relationships. And they really felt like the culture pressures, particularly Western culture, pressures people to believe that the goal of adult development is to become this independent person and be able to make it on your own. And that culture also really, Western culture in particular, U.S. culture in particular, really reinforces this myth of individual achievement, and that those kinds of focus on individuality and individual achievement are really harmful to people, because it can make people feel ashamed of needing help. It can make people think if they can't make it on their own, there's something wrong with them. And so that's really where the theory emerged. And then we can talk more about this, but there's also an important piece in there about cultural context and understanding human development and human experience. So I could talk for hours about RCT, but that's a little bit of an overview.
And you know, I love it. So it's one of those things where, yeah, we could be here forever talking about the power of this theory and what it looks like in practical application. But let's go there, because you started the conversation. So let's talk a little bit about how does it show up in a cultural context, because with all the unrest that we've seen, not just recently, but I mean historically in this country, how can RCT be used to address those cultural issues and particularly deal with issues of race?
Sure. Well, I think one thing that's important to understand about relational cultural theory is that I think sometimes when people first hear of the theory and how the focus is on growth in relationship and connection, they might imagine that it's a pretty lightweight theory, that it's all sort of this happy, everybody be connected, kind of worldview. And certainly the theory celebrates connection and relationship and meaningful interactions. But the theory, really from its earliest days of development, also acknowledges that there is conflict in relationship. There can be disappointments in relationship, that relationships ebb and flow. And so part of the work of working and living as an RCT practitioner is really learning to deepen our understanding of how to deal with conflict, and deal with ruptures in relationship and so on. So with that as a backdrop, as far as RCT and cultural context, so when the theory was first developed, the initial scholars really were white women who were probably middle or upper middle class, at least. And from what I understand, they weren't really paying a lot of attention to race and social class and sexual orientation and nationality and all kinds of other identities that are given social weight in U.S. culture and around the world. And then when sort of a second early generation of scholars joined that group, they pushed these women to say, we have to think about cultural context, that cultural context shapes the way we are seen in the world, and that influences how we can move through the world. And so then the C in the middle, the relational cultural theory, was added to the name. It wasn't originally called RCT. And so, I think there are lots of ways it can be helpful. Frankly, as a white person initially, when I was studying RCT and really thinking about the cultural piece, the first piece I began to understand was that I guess it put language to the idea that I had to understand that people with identities different from my own are having a different lived experience because of that cultural context, that they're met differently in the world. They might face a different set of obstacles. And then I have to get way beyond my reference group and really, I primarily, most of my time is spent as a teacher. And so when I'm working with students, I have to really be mindful that their cultural context based on identity might be very different from my own. A deeper level of awareness that I finally came to was to also understand that, and I think part of what I was also aware of was that my own minoritized identities also shape my experience. But the deeper lesson I had to learn was that my whiteness also shapes my experience. So it's also being aware not only of what students arrive with, but what I arrive with, I guess, through my experience as someone who's perceived as white in U.S. culture.
So let's talk a bit about that, the identity piece, because you and I have been working with students at Antioch. And one of the things that we've really been talking about is our own identity and this idea of narrative identity, how we tell stories, and those stories actually inform the way that we show up and how we identify not only with ourselves, but others and how we see the world. And as you talk about lived experience, talk a bit about your identity and how, you kind of alluded to it, but I want to go a little bit deeper about your identity and how that has impacted you and the way that you show up in the world and how it has helped you with your students in all honesty.
Sure. Well, so, I grew up in Eastern Pennsylvania in a rural area of the Poconos. And I'm just picturing a map and how far the Poconos are from Texas. But I grew up in Eastern Pennsylvania, and I now live in Pittsburgh. I was actually born here in Pittsburgh, grew up in Eastern PA, and then ended up back here in the early 90s and have been here since. But in that rural area of Eastern Pennsylvania, my family was one of very few Jewish families. There were very few Jewish kids in my school district. I think there were really two other Jewish families, and they didn't really have very strong Jewish identities from what I could tell. So I grew up with that awareness of being sort of an outsider in some ways. There are also a lot of families up there where the families had lived there for generations, and my parents moved us up there, so I was also not really from that area. So I think early on I was aware of being an outsider, of what it meant to be perceived as different because of my Jewish identity. But what I wasn't aware of was that being white also gave me a certain ease and meant that I didn't face certain obstacles that I would have faced if I weren't white. So that awareness came much later. But I think my early sort of interest in social justice really came from growing up as sort of an outsider in some ways because of being Jewish. And then in my 20s, I came out. So I then became sort of very aware of another part of outsider status, which is being a lesbian. And so those two pieces really, I think, helped me sort of increase my sensitivity around social justice issues and made me more passionate. And then it becomes like a lifelong process, right? I mean, I'm always trying to learn more about my own identities and how they shape me and other cultural groups that I'm still learning about. And it's just a journey that keeps getting deeper and deeper. I can also share one of the ways in which a lot of this comes together. It's a story you've heard me share before, which is, so as I've said, I live here in Pittsburgh. I actually live a couple blocks away from the Tree of Life synagogue, where the white supremacists massacred several people on October 27th, 2018. And that day was a real turning point for me. I wasn't there. That's not my primary synagogue. I belong to a Reform temple that's maybe another 10 minutes away from here. But I really am just a few blocks from Tree of Life. I remember that day vividly. I was here at home working that morning and learned that there was some sort of a emergency event happening over at Tree of Life, and then started to hear sirens. I looked online for news and learned that there was an active shooter situation. And so I was really hearing the sirens of the first responders heading to Tree of Life. So it was that close. And then I went to a gathering in Squirrel Hill that evening, and other local events. But that moment really changed me, because while I've grown up aware of anti-Semitism, and certainly I suspect have some historical trauma connected to the Holocaust, I think I didn't, how can I say this? I think I was always aware that I could face anti-Semitism, and I've probably faced it in my career even, but I don't think I really thought violence would hit that close to home for me as a Jew living in the United States. So it was a pivotal moment, and I had lots of sort of post-trauma experiences that I think are pretty typical. Things like, over the next several months, I'd be out, we'd go to some event, and I'd be in a crowd, and I would be very vigilant about what was going on around me, where are the exits. I remember sitting in temple one morning, again, my temple, not Tree of Life, but one morning after, a couple weeks, I think, after the massacre, and I saw someone it was a white guy sitting like across the aisle from me, a couple rows away. And he just didn't look like he was very interested in the service. He didn't look like he was really following it. And I started to get really fixated on, like, does he belong here? Is he a terrorist? Then I'm trying to see if he might have a gun on him. And I'm like, this is like also way over, like, I'm not a security officer, right? This is like way past me. But I was really fixated on him. And then I realized all of a sudden he's probably an undercover security officer is what he is. And then I calmed down. But I'm sharing all that to say that I was really feeling, I think for quite a while after that massacre, and still occasionally, I felt unsafe, right? I felt very unsafe in the world. And then sort of another piece of the story is that I remember vividly one day I was walking my dog here in the neighborhood, and I was thinking about how every day I was waking up with this visceral sense of fear regarding my safety. And I started to think, is this what my Black and brown friends live with every day and have for generations? And of course, I want to be really clear, François, that I'm not trying to say I get it or I've now lived what you might live, but I felt like maybe I was getting just a small glimpse of what it's like to live with that sort of fear for your basic safety. And so I really tried to sit with that for a while, and it made me incredibly sad and concerned, and I was aware of the toll it was taking on me. It was exhausting. It was distracting. Mm-hmm. I felt like I was sort of operating in a fog for a while. And I thought about, again, friends and colleagues who get up and go to work every day and, watch their kids learn to drive and watch their kids go off to college and are trying to make it in the world and are, doing their jobs and showing up. And if they've been living with this every day and for generations, it just was really, like, even as I talk about it now, I can just feel it. Like, it was an important moment for me. So I hope it sounds okay, the sort of way I'm describing